Thanks very much. This lecture really is all about reducing uncertainty in orthodontics, and it really is that balance between evidence that's derived from research versus claims that are made in terms of sort of unsubstantiated claims and snake oil. So first of all, just to show people where I'm from England, which is a part of the United Kingdom, which is a small island on the west coast of Europe. Manchester is here. The UK is divided up into two main areas really, which is the north and the south. The south is colder, more industrial. Sorry, the north is colder, wetter and more industrial than the beautiful south, which is always warm and the sun always shines. This is London here, where our current set of leaders are managing our COVID crisis. So Manchester is in the north of England. It's a very proud old city. It's very famous for several things. It's a very vibrant, modern economy, and it was a city that is certainly going places in terms of its overall quality of life and prosperity. It's also known as the Rainy City. This is because it's on the west coast of a country, which is on the west coast of a continent, and the Atlantic Ocean bordered us about 40 kilometers away. This slide in the middle is completely true. This is spring in Manchester, summer in Manchester, autumn in Manchester, and winter in Manchester. It's the rain in Manchester is sort of very gentle. It lasts a long time and it makes the whole city seem rather wet. And in fact, it's just about starting to rain now. That rain is important though, and it was very important in terms of the industry of Manchester, because one of Manchester's great industry is cotton, and the cotton used to be shipped over from the Southern American states to be spun in Manchester. And one of the main reasons for that was that the air is damp, and if you're going to spin cotton, well, the air needs to be damp. So this is the Manchester Ship Canal, which is a canal that was dug from Manchester to Liverpool, a distance of about 40 miles, to allow ocean-going ships to come into Manchester to deliver the cotton and then take it away as it was spun. So Manchester became an incredibly prosperous part of the world. However, like most prosperous parts of the world, it went into decay in the massive recession really that the UK had in the in the 1970s and 1980, and many of the old cotton mills and old stations fell into disrepair. However, Manchester has become more flourishing, predominantly thanks to the UK's membership of the European Union and the injection of funds that brought. Manchester is a very flourishing contemporary and modern city. These pictures are of the area around the old ship canal, the area around the docks and the town hall. They're all partially true. This in fact is what the buildings look like, but the sky is not as blue as this ever. Manchester is also famous for various things like Manchester United Football Club. I have a season ticket here. Some people think that this is a picture of Manchester United playing football. It's not. It's a picture of me, and this is my seat there in one of the sort of stands in my season ticket. One relatively interesting fact about me is that I've had a season ticket for nearly 30 years, and I now am one of the 5,000 people whose name is on their seat in the 80,000 seater stadium. The other thing that my children, for some reason, are particularly proud of is this. So this is my house. You might think this looks a very small house. In fact, it is, but it's in a pretty expensive part of Didsbury. my house in South Manchester, which is where most of the university live, my house isn't important here. What we need to do is look at Google Street View. And those of you who are familiar with Google Street View can see the old navigation tools in this corner. So one Sunday morning, I spotted the Google streetcar. And if you have a look down a street, you can see a person here running towards the cameras. The car moves down these side streets. And so my claim to fame that my children hold in maximum regard, regardless of anything else I've ever done, is actually that I am on Google Street View. And I may well be the only person of the audience today who's actually got their picture on Google Street View. In fact, because of the way the streets were laid out, I got my picture on 3 times.
And your haircut is the same, by the way, Kevin.
My haircut is the same, actually, which is interesting because this is a COVID haircut that my wife did last week with a pair of clippers, and we were thinking when it was last this short, and it looks the same. So that really is a brief introduction into me and Google Street View, Manchester football and season tickets. But that's not what we've really come to hear. We've come to hear really my views about orthodontics. Orthodontics is a very interesting field, and one of the best ways of thinking about orthodontic treatment is to think about it as a journey. And it's a journey from the start to the finish of a course of treatment. And if we consider it like a journey and consider the journeys that we take whenever we're traveling anywhere, is that we all take similar routes. We all head for pretty much the same place, but sometimes our routes are subtly different. You know, if I was going to London, for example, I would probably catch the train. Colleagues of mine or friends wouldn't necessarily catch the train. They prefer to drive, going slightly different ways, different routes, making choices about what we want to do, making our routes different, but we get there in the end. And that's an important concept about orthodontics and orthodontic treatment, is what we're doing is we're taking a start of a case, we're taking an all aiming for a sort of a similar type of finish. But we all do things slightly differently. But we all tend to get there in the end, which is why a lot of orthodontic research, for example, doesn't necessarily provide us with interesting facts, because we're all getting to the same end point. So we try and bear that in mind, that this really reflects the great variety that occurs within orthodontic treatment. So let's think a little more about orthodontic treatment and this overall concept of uncertainty. Now, within our lives, there is uncertainty. Uncertainty surrounds us. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty now. We actually don't really know what's going to be happening in the UK, we don't know what's going to be happening next week. But we actually don't know what's going to be happening in 3 months, 6 months, 2 or 3 years. So we live with uncertainty as a sort of overall species, and we don't tolerate that uncertainty very well. In fact, when we consider our lives, the only thing that is certain about our lives, and it is depressing, and it's depressing at the moment, is that the only thing that's certain is that one day we will die. We're all going to die. That's the certainty. The uncertainty is we actually don't know how. So in terms of our lives, we tolerate uncertainty to varying degrees. And I'm going to return to that theme as we go through, because that uncertainty is also present in all clinical decisions, if we accept that uncertainty is in 100% of our lives. And it is a poor practitioner who is 100% certain about every clinical decision that they take. And that's quite an important concept. But what we want to try and do in research is reduce that uncertainty, to try and make that uncertainty more tolerable, and also to enable us to explain to our patients with degrees of certainty about the various success or failure, for example, of their treatment, or the way they might feel, or their burden of care. So we use research to attempt to reduce that uncertainty. However, the other side of that is uncertainty is then increased by claims that are based on low levels of evidence. And that is the dilemma. And that's where we sort of have this seesaw of evidenced and non-evidenced claims being built up in orthodontics. We also have to consider how much more research is needed to completely eliminate uncertainty. We'll never completely eliminate it, but we can reduce it to a tolerable degree. For example, we know there are certain areas of orthodontics where we don't need to carry out any more research. One of those is functional appliances. We know functional appliances don't modify facial growth to a meaningful degree. We know that they tip teeth. We also know that if you run a cephalometric analysis across a lot of variables in a functional appliance study, you will find something just by chance that appears to be statistically and maybe clinically significant. So I don't need any more studies into the effects of functional appliances to tell me how they work. I don't want to see another study looking at cephalometric variables in functional appliances. I don't also want to see another systematic review telling me how functional appliances work. We know. So there becomes a limit as to how much more research is needed. And we've reached that in some areas, but other areas are completely wide open and a large amount of research is still needed. Because what we're trying to do is practice evidence-based care and sort of move our care away from our origins as the barber surgeons who really carried out simple treatment that was pretty much unevidenced. And I'd like to think that orthodontics has moved a long way since then, I would hope. Just to reinforce this overall concept though, I'm just going to quickly nip into the pyramid of clinical evidence just to sort of reinforce some aspects of this. I'm not going to spend long because this has become common knowledge. So the pyramid of clinical evidence, we know that the lowest level of evidence is the simple case report, where a treatment has worked well and someone publishes it or talks about it and sort of says, hey ho, this works well, perhaps we should think about doing this. That's a very low level of evidence and it certainly shouldn't change practice. Next level up is a case series where, which in many ways are multiple case reports, and it's where the same treatment has worked well several times and someone has produced a paper describing that. There are low levels of evidence, but actually once you're starting to get into case series, you have to start to think, has somebody actually got something there? And so that often tends to be the first phase really of the development and establishment of a new treatment. Next up is case control, which is the classic orthodontic study where we look backwards. This was the way all orthodontic research used to be done, where people used to go back into their model storage rooms, collect some models together. Once they'd got the models together and the records together, they used to think of a study question, and then they would dredge the data until they found information. That is useful for generating questions, but it shouldn't change practice because of the high levels of selection bias that are present. Next up is prospective cohort, where you take a group of patients at one point, you follow them through time, they all stay in the study, and that provides quite useful information. Next up is the randomized trial, which we know an awful lot about now in orthodontics, in which you randomly allocate patients to interventions and you see which is the best or which is the most effective intervention. And then trials move into, and the data is combined into systematic reviews to provide us with a solid level of evidence as we can, but only if the systematic review only includes randomized trials and not everything else in these lower levels, because there's absolutely no point in that at all. So that's our levels of evidence that we need to think about. I would say that the only thing that would probably change my clinical practice is evidence from a trial. These levels are interesting. I'm not disparaging them, but they generate questions which can be tested in trials. So this is where I was, and this is in terms of overall evidence and establishment of evidence. And I was always absolutely determined to follow sort of evidence-based orthodontics, and I would always try to do that. However, that approach, or the evidence-based medicine movement, was starting to be criticised maybe 5 to 10 years ago as perhaps having gone too far towards trials and ignoring things such as patient opinion and also clinicians' opinion. From my point of view, a personal experience also has made me rethink some of the things that perhaps I said all those years ago about the values of trials. And so this is a personal experience of mine. So what I want us to do is not think about orthodontics now, is think about, I want us to consider a neck. So this is an MRI scan of somebody's neck. Those who are observant will notice that it's the neck of someone called Kevin. So this is my neck. Anybody, and it's always quite interesting to see an MRI scan of your own body because you get quite interested. You know, it's quite reassuring to me here that I can see I've got a cerebellum. And I think this is something called the pons at this point. The airway people saying, oh, look at his airway. But this is an MR scan, and I was breathing and things like that. The important reason that this was taken was here. And if between C6 and C7, and you can see that my spinal cord has been narrowed, and it's been narrowed quite considerably in that the area for the CSF is now being compressed. And the thing that was happening here was that the back of my vertebrae at C6, C7 had collapsed. It was compressing the spinal nerves or the cervical nerves. What that resulted in was initially I thought I'd got a cricked neck. Then I got a lot of pain about 3 or 4 months later in my arms. Then my fingers started to tingle and go numb. And then I lost motor function in my right hand. I actually thought I could fix this with yoga. That didn't really work. And so our next port of call was, let's go and see someone to see how we fix this. So me being the type of person I was, being deeply entrenched in Quackery and systematic reviews, I went and considered a systematic review. And so this was the systematic review that I got out of the Cochrane collaboration, which is about interbody fusion techniques for cervical degenerative disc disease. In effect, it is what do you do about people who have got a collapsed cervical spine. The review was quite interesting. I thought I'm going to get something good out of this, but as I began to read through it, I knew what the conclusion was going to be. The conclusion, in effect, was for reduction of pain in patients with degenerative disc disease, there's no superior treatment. The literature is hampered by few studies, small studies, and generally poor research design. A common conclusion in a lot of Cochrane reviews. That's a little upsetting when you've actually got a condition that you feel needs fixing, in that there's no real evidence behind that. So what we have to do now is consider a neurosurgeon, because they're the people that fix cervical spines. So I went to see the neurosurgeon, who was, he looked to me as though he was about 12, which was a little worrying. But in fact, this was a guy who was in his mid-40s and on the top of his game for a surgeon. He said that I was an ideal candidate. He hadn't killed anybody for a while, which was a bonus. There's one systematic review which I'd spotted, and I'd sort of said, I found a systematic review, and he said, yeah, that tells us nothing. This is surgery, and surgery is an art, not a science. And that's the approach that we've got to take here. So he said the benefits from you having surgery is it will reduce the chance of you severing your spinal cord if you have an accident. I cycle all over Manchester, so that was an interesting concept. I've got an 80% chance of curing your neck and arm pain, 70% chance of completely resolving the numbness in your fingers, 50% chance of no neck muscle pain, and a 90% chance of no further progression. I've got that from my own individual figures and also from cohort studies, which is the highest level of evidence we've got. He said, you'll come into Salford Royal Hospital, which is the regional tertiary neurosurgery facility. It's fairly straightforward. It's going to take me 3, probably 5 hours to do because it's a bit tricky. You're in for one night and there's just going to be a small scar in the front of your neck. So I said, at this point, Alan, that's quite interesting because I understand cervical spine anatomy. This is the front of my neck, but my spine is at the back. And he said, yeah, that's no problem. What we do is we make a small cut in your neck. We get your major neurovascular bundle and we move it that way. We take your trachea and esophagus and we move it that way. And we tunnel to the back of your spine. I drill out the disc with dental drills, which is interesting. Pop bone chips in, fuse the whole lot together. You're done and dusted in 5 hours. What are the risks? He said, these are the serious risks, death, carotid damage, paraplegia, and life-threatening infection. He said, these are the minor ones as far as we're concerned. I said, Alan, I'm a bit concerned some of those minor ones don't sound much fun, never mind the major. And he said, okay, well, this is your call.
You need to add to this COVID-19 now, Kevin.
We would have to add COVID at the moment. Well, I'd be postponed. That's what would happen. So these are the benefits, these are the risks. What are you going to do? And in fact, I had the operation done. It worked brilliantly. I'm pretty much back to normal. I get an occasional pain in the neck if I've been sleeping funnily, but it worked brilliantly. But the reason I've gone through that in quite a lot of detail is it provides great illustration to me when I had it done of what evidence-based care really is. And what evidence-based care is, it's clinical experience. First, you can't get away from this, particularly in orthodontics, that a lot of our decisions are based on clinical experience, and that's very important. However, it should interface with clinical research. And one thing that is very important here, and I can't emphasize this enough, while we can go with clinical experience for our decisions, if we've got clinical research present about an area that we're interested in treating, the research evidence should outweigh our clinical experience. We only accept clinical experience, or we should only accept clinical experience in the absence of clinical research. As soon as clinical research comes in, that's it. We should always be operating by clinical research if it's good. And by that I mean trials and systematic reviews. Because what we then need to do is put our clinical experience, our clinical research together so that we can inform our patients about the various risks and benefits with a degree of certainty. And that allows us to practice evidence-based care. Importantly, if we're going to lead on clinical experience, I think ethically we have to explain it to our patients. So we would have to say, there's not much research in this area, but actually my clinical experience suggests that we could be doing it this way. You should also be saying, there's a new treatment out. I've never done it, but I've been on a course and I've seen how it's done. Or I've heard someone talk about this at a conference. Or I've heard a key opinion leader say that this is a great type of treatment and I'd like to try it on you. You're informing the patient properly. But I can't emphasize enough, in the absence of research, you're probably ethically bound to say to patients, actually, we're going to treat you this way. There is some research, for example, but actually a lot of this is based on clinical experience. And that's where we are in orthodontics, and we can't get away from it. So, is orthodontics different from medicine? In some respects, because people say to me, well, we don't need to worry too much about research and evidence because this is just orthodontics. I don't think orthodontics is different. I think many of our patients have major problems. they require treatment. We can all think of patients who are very concerned about their appearance, patients who don't go to school, patients whose lives have been made a misery from teasing. And we must be very careful not to always equate that to the severity of their malocclusion, particularly nowadays in the social media driven world where our patients are so concerned about their appearance, constantly taking selfies, being targeted, being teased, and things such as that. So orthodontics shouldn't be any different from any other type of medical specialty. We should be always looking at those three circles that I discussed. So at this point, you have to sort of stop and think here. Okay, matey, how's your research helped us then? In what way have you been of any use in terms of orthodontic research? And how do we enter this sort of discussion about evidence and snake oil? So what I'm going to do is just highlight a little bit of research that I've done in the past and explain really whether I think it's been useful or not, and has it helped us reduce uncertainty. So we're going to look, first of all, back at early class 2 treatment. This was done in a blog post. I blogged about this back in June 2015, about the wheel turning consistently on class 2 treatment. And it was really a follow-up from when I spoke at the AAO conference in a symposium about early class 2 treatment. And I think I managed to upset a fair number of people in that audience, because I started off by saying it was a dead question, early treatment for class 2, because the research has been done. And I didn't really see why the AAO was having this debate, and that perhaps it was time that American orthodontics moved on and started to embrace evidence when it was available. So that's why I sort of called it the wheel keeps turning and the pyramid of denial, and I'll come to the pyramid of denial later. So this is really, as you know, I've done a lot of research into class 2 problems. So we're looking predominantly now at a Cochrane review, which we updated about 2 or 3 years ago, looking at the treatment of class 2 problems. So the aim of our review and the aim of all these studies was to assess the effect of early orthodontic treatment for class 2 malocclusion. And so there was a dilemma. There still is a bit of a dilemma, actually, is when we see an 8-year-old child with a large overdebt, do we treat early and then again as an adolescent, or do we treat when they're an adolescent only? That was our clinical dilemma. And by that we mean taking a patient like this with a very large overjet, retrusive mandible, poor profile, treating them when they're in the transitional dentition, when they're about 8 or 9, taking them to here with a twin block. I did this one with a twin block, with improvement of a profile, and then sitting waiting for the establishment of the permanent dentition and finishing them there. This is miracle orthodontic treatment. This is someone who responded to a functional appliance very well. I didn't do anything special. I think we just struck lucky that she grew. I think it's a good orthodontic result. I've got her teeth in the right place. I don't know what I've done to her airway, because that's the latest fad that's gathering momentum now. And I was lucky. And if this was our level of evidence, we'd be treating everybody early because this worked. However, it doesn't always work, as we showed in the research. So the claims for early treatment in those days were treatment's faster. You get more skeletal change because you're stimulating the mandible for longer, and stimulated mandibles grow. You get a reduction in trauma because you're reducing the overjet and the teeth don't hit the ground first. You don't have to have treatment, you don't have to have extractions because extractions are evil, and they compromise all sorts of problems. We'd all like to avoid extractions, but there are times that we have to do them. But the claims were that early treatment would reduce extractions, and it would also improve breathing, improve performance at school, grade point average, and the child's entire life. So what did we find? So we updated the review, and just to look at the review, really these are the classic studies that were done in those days, the trials that were done in Florida, North Carolina and the UK. This is the risk of bias table from those trials, and they showed really that the earlier studies did have degrees of bias that had crept in according to the Quackery tool. The one we did in the UK was green all the way across because we learnt from these studies, and we actually corrected some of the issues that they had. But nevertheless, they gave us what we would call a moderate level of evidence. So when we looked at treatment at the end of everything, so this is when the children were 16, when all their treatment has finished, and they had been randomly allocated to early intervention or no early intervention, we found this. You don't need statistics here. Anything that's got a naught in front of the decimal point means it's not important. And so we actually found from this point that in terms of overjet, A and B, skeletal pattern, PAR, self-concept, nearly everything that we measured in those studies, providing treatment early, didn't make any difference. It made no benefit. No one got any benefit from being treated early, apart from trauma. And we looked very carefully at trauma, and trauma was very interesting. And this was published in the AJO, and it got in very quickly because it was a sort of a positive result for treatment. But in effect, what we showed was these were the patients here who had treatment in one course when they were an adolescent. Early means they had one course of treatment when they were 8 or 9 to reduce the overjet early, and then had another course of treatment in adolescence. Remember, they were randomized to this, and this is the difference. So the children who...
Sorry, Kevin, sorry to interrupt you. I received some request that if you can speak slightly loudly, or you come closer. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Is that better? I've moved my mic a bit closer.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I'm tired. It's 6 o'clock on a Friday.
Don't worry. We'll send you a bottle of wine.
So, are you happy with that volume?
Yes, it's good. Good. Okay. Because some people, they are using iPad or tablets or, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in terms, so we've got the two groups of patients here. So when someone received treatment as an adolescent, their risk of trauma was 31%. When they had treatment early, their risk of trauma was 19%, giving us a difference of 12%. So there was a 12% reduction in trauma. Two things that are quite important is this amount of trauma is quite high, but it's reinforced by other studies. But it's also very relevant to consider that even when you had treatment done early, you still had trauma. You still had a 20% chance of trauma. So early treatment did not eliminate trauma. And that, I think, is very relevant. But nevertheless, we ended up with a difference of 12%, which is interesting and probably clinically significant. So we could put this into a website called Spinning the Risk, and this allows you to explain probabilities to your patients. So Spinning the Risk come up with this that said one of the things we should be saying to our patients is that your chance of experiencing incisal trauma without early treatment is 31%, but it's reduced to 19% with early treatment. You can look at it in another way in terms of these smiley faces. So a good outcome is no trauma, a bad outcome is trauma. So you could say to one of your patients, particularly if they're 8 or 9, because they understand these quite nicely, that your chance, if we treat you, if we don't treat you, if we wait until you are 11 or 12, this is the chance of you ending up in this group of bad outcome, which is traumatized incisors. But if we do treat you, we do increase the chance that you're not going to have trauma, and there's a less of a chance of you ending up in this bad outcome group. And that's quite a useful tool to help patients understand. We also should look at relative risk reduction, because it's a good way to look at this, because the risk of a bad event isn't avoided in both of these types of treatment. So you have to look at this concept of relative risk reduction. And that looks at the risk within each of the groups. And those studies showed that early treatment reduces the risk of trauma here by 33%. Again, clinically significant. The last way to look at this in a public health system is this concept of numbers needed to treat. These are the numbers of people we need to treat to prevent one child having a bad episode. So we calculated that in order to prevent one child from experiencing incisal trauma, we need to treat 10 children early. So when someone is holding the purse strings and it's not you, say it's the public sector, those people that run the public sector really have to look at this and think, okay, so I have to treat 10 children to avoid one episode of incisal trauma. Is it worth it in terms of a public health system? And that's something that certainly is relevant and needs looking at. So what are we going to do here? At the end of the day, when we analysed all this data, we still had moderate degrees of uncertainty. There was something there, but we have to think, so what are we going to do? I think the answer to that is quite easy. We have to explain that to our patients. We've got the tools to do it in the graphics that I showed you. We've got the information from the trials and the systematic reviews. We can say to our patients that early treatment doesn't really help you very much, but it may reduce the chance of trauma. Do you want to take the hassle of having early treatment, which means more visits, to reduce the trauma? Or do you want to take that risk and you want to have one course of treatment when you're an adolescent? And that's where evidence helps. And I think that's a really good example of a research-based approach to evidence-based orthodontic care, because that area has been researched extensively. There's moderate uncertainty there. Further research is likely to change the uncertainty. So actually, I think people should be doing more early treatment and interceptive studies. Interceptive orthodontics, it's always interested me. Now my career is finished, I'm somewhat frustrated that I didn't build on the class 2 studies. When we finished them, I sort of got involved in other stuff. But really, I think interceptive and sort of developmental orthodontics is incredibly important, and we need further research in that area. So let's look at something which is a little bit more mainstream, and this is temporary anchorage devices. A new development released on the market, promoted to a degree, but not as wildly as some of the stuff that we're seeing at the moment.
You didn't tell me, Kevin, you didn't tell me that you have a PhD in mini screw. I could add this to your, card of career. That's a huge.
I decided to look for a picture that I could use to illustrate things here. It's a very poor Photoshop. I keep meaning to do that again. I learned a lot here. It's not a very good idea to type on a public computer in a university big screw. You get all sorts of other interesting pictures first before you get this picture. But so temporary anchorage devices, interesting development, but extensively researched very quickly. And I've included this really because we've got a lot of information on these. So Cochrane review, one that we did, we picked up this from Sheffield. The lead author on this was Safa Jambi, who was a research student of mine. I also did this with Jonathan Sandler because this was part of his and Safa's PhD. So we asked, do temporary anchorage devices work? Simple, straightforward question in a systematic review. There were 3 comparisons here. These were a palatal arch with an Nance button, temporary anchorage devices, and headgear. Most Manchester patients who are wearing headgear look like this. And it's a rather strange and off-putting picture, I feel, but it's the only good headgear picture I could find. Looking at our bias there, these studies were quite good. There's no red here. They're all providing a reasonable amount of evidence. However, there's quite a lot of orange, which adds a bit of uncertainty to our overall interpretation. What did these studies show? These studies essentially showed, when we put them all together, the total here in the meta-analysis was that if you use a temporary anchorage device, you get about 2.1 millimeters extra anchorage than with headgear or a plate large. The confidence intervals are relatively narrow, so we can be relatively certain about this, but in effect, you get 2 millimeters extra anchorage with a temporary anchorage device. Is that clinically significant? That's for you to decide. I would say it is, and it would perhaps persuade me to use temporary anchorage devices in maximum anchorage cases. So there was moderate uncertainty, and again, further research is likely to have an effect and may change uncertainty. So that's what we did. Jonathan Sandler did his PhD looking at anchorage reinforcement for maximum anchorage in adolescents. I was the major supervisor on the PhD, and this was a 3-arm multi-center randomized trial. What he found was a little different. He got less reinforcement of anchorage with his temporary anchorage devices than the other studies. And there are reasons for that, and it's probably that there was less bias within his study because we'd learned from the other studies. And you have to think, okay, so does it reduce our certainty? It actually showed, when you put all this into the meta-analysis, that with John's paper, because it reduced the uncertainty in terms of a large number of patients, the difference dropped to 2 millimeters because he didn't find such a large effect size, but the confidence intervals reduced. So we're now coming to the decision that you're getting about 2 millimeters. Studies being added to systematic reviews increase our overall level of certainty. And those are 2 examples really of studies that I've included because really I like talking about my own research. I don't think people should lecture using other people's research in literature reviews, but also it allows us to provide information to patients about certain types of treatment. And those areas have been researched very well. So I was sort of feeling that I'm living in an orthodontic nirvana where we have evidence from trials which is influencing our decisions and treatment decisions, falling perfectly into that area of evidence-based orthodontics. But all's not well in my orthodontic nirvana because the wheel keeps turning and the pot keeps being stirred in terms of the competing influences on orthodontics and the sort of, I'm not sure it's right to say they attempt to counteract research, but I think ignore research. So we're now going to move forwards to the factors that work against research evidence and maybe stifle free thought and stifle research and the benefit of research. So one of these is this concept that I wrote, that I sort of knocked up in a blog post that became very popular. And this is the pyramid of denial. And these are the reasons that people will not accept the results of trials. And these, I've based this on my personal experiences, mostly when I had been giving lectures and people have come up to me afterwards to let me know what they think. So first of all, the lowest level of the pyramid of denial is someone that comes up to you and says, yeah, that lecture was great. Or they make a comment on social media. Say, oh yeah, that's great, but actually it's all very well, but I know better than you. I just know best and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ignore it. And the next one up is we know better. A group of people get together and say, as a group, we know better than the results of that research. So again, we're going to ignore it. A really good one is where people come up and say, yeah, that was a really interesting study, but actually it would have been really helpful to you if you'd asked us our opinions first, because we could have put you in the right direction. We then move up to other concepts here, which is quite simply, you did it wrong. Your study is so poor, it's poor, you've just done it wrong. Then we move to your findings aren't individualized, they're not relevant. And the important concept there is that they're assuming that if someone's doing a study or they're doing a trial, that of course we're treating to the numbers, we're not treating the individual patients. That concept is completely wrong, because in trials you have to abide by ethics. And so you would treat patients to the best of your ability. So that concept of treatment not being individualized is completely incorrect. The last thing they then say is, oh, of course, that's very interesting, but my patients are different. That in effect means that their patients are genetically, sociologically, and completely different to any other set of patients in the world. The patients in their town are not the same as anybody else's. All this is complete nonsense, but you see it time and time again in conferences, people giving presentations, and also on social media, which is having a greater influence than perhaps we would really like it to be from a clinical care point of view. So that leads us into orthodontic quackery, which in effect, quackery is defined as the promotion of unsubstantiated methods that lack a scientifically plausible rationale. And that really sums up quackery as a whole, is there's no scientific basis to some of the methods that are being promoted. So when we think about it, orthodontic quackery tends to recommend against conventional therapies. So the alternative therapy is often put forward as being better than the conventional therapy with limited evidence. It could promote potentially harmful therapies. It's very difficult to cause harm in orthodontics. However, probably the only way we can do that is burnout cooperation with poor types of treatment that rely on a lot of cooperation, that actually will then, when someone treats the child after, say, a potential failure, it makes it much more difficult. It could, in some respects, look at things such as root resorption and move the teeth out of the bone, and that could be potentially harmful. It promotes a degree of magical thinking, in that you make suggestions, oh, well, by doing this, it's going to help the student's grade point average because we're going to have them breathing better. You know, these are the claims that are often made. The other thing is it drains patients' bank accounts because, quite surprisingly, a lot of the orthodontic fringe treatment is amazingly expensive. And certainly in the UK, it's absolutely amazing, I think, that some people go and get treated by the orthodontic fringe at fees of many thousands of pounds, when they could have equally effective treatment and better treatment for free on the National Health Service. But of course, they've fallen into the trap of the alternative medicine. So I wrote a blog post called "I've Decided to Become an Orthodontic Quack and Snake Oil Salesman." If you want to have a look back at it, it was quite interesting because it got some very interesting responses. You can see here it got 54 comments. It's way up now. Some people took great exception to some of the things I said, but I still stand by it. Still stand by that one. I'm particularly. I was pleased with this one, and I'm still pleased. In fact, I might repost it just to get the pot stirring a little bit more. But in that, I said, this is the quackery checklist. One thing that you do is develop a new disease. Step one. That can be anything. So our new disease can have all sorts of fancy names. I think one new disease that we've suddenly become very interested in orthodontics is airway problems in children. Airway problems are an issue in children, there's no doubt. But can we fix them with orthodontics? No, we can't. That's what our state of knowledge is. But suddenly, we're suddenly developing a new disease to be treated by orthodontic airway physicians. We develop a new method of diagnosis. Only the people who are doing this new treatment can actually diagnose it. We're getting this evidence now in terms of CBCT imaging and airway measurement and things such as that, where we know airway measurement in CBCT isn't accurate, but that's our new special way of diagnosis. We can have a new name for treatment. There's lots of new names for treatments that people bring up. They often involve the words functional or motion and all this business. You develop a new name for your treatment. Sagittal first, that's another example of treatment. Sagittal first, that's not new. Functional appliances have been around for years. We've been doing sagittal first, but suddenly we've got a new type of treatment to do sagittal first. It's class 2 elastics. It's like a functional appliance. It's nothing special. We set up courses for dentists if we're really working on the fringe, and we set up courses for dentists because they don't understand orthodontics. And it's easy to sell them the snake oil. And we also criticize others. We criticize everybody else because we're doing better. And finally, we resist debate and dismiss research evidence. We don't take any of that into account when we give presentations. So that's our quackery checklist. So the next time you see somebody talking about their type of treatment, it's often a good idea to see how many of the quackery checklists they tick. Sometimes at the AAO conference, I go and play quackery bingo. So I wander around looking at the good thing is on the exhibition floor where you get key opinion leaders giving presentations to very small audiences of about 10 to 20 people in their industry sponsored stands. They never appear on the main program. The big key opinion leaders, it's quite interesting, prefer to speak to groups of about 20 to 30 people rather than stand up in front of a couple of thousand on the main program. But take the quackery checklist, sit down and tick these off. And it's so I play quackery bingo when I wander around the trade floor. And it's quite surprising how many of these come up. So that leads me quite nicely into, I think I should become an orthodontic key opinion leader. This was a post I did back in 2017. And essentially it was me saying that this is what I need to do to become a KOL. Again, I got a lot of comments on this one. I think it was quite close to the bone several times, but I felt quite strongly about it because I'd had a bad experience, I think, at one of the AAO meetings. So what are key opinion leaders? Key opinion leaders are predominantly specialist orthodontists who talk about company promoted appliances. And there's a long history of this now in orthodontics. I've not really highlighted this group more than any other. They're all pretty much the same. This is the Henry Schein key opinion leaders. I don't know why they're jumping up and down here. I think it's a sort of a celebration at the end of one of their meetings. Several things strike me. Some of them have dressed down as if that's a sort of a trendy thing to do. I wonder if this is a competition to see who can jump the highest and perhaps do even better as a key opinion leader. But these are the Henry Schein key opinion leaders jumping up and down on the stage, which is an interesting thing to be doing. And I'm still mystified as to why they do this. I don't think I've ever jumped up and down on an orthodontic stage, and I don't think anybody sort of major world speakers jump up and down, but for some reason they do this. Key opinion leader are doctors who influence their peers' practice, including but not limited to their treatment behaviour. Importantly, they give lectures promoting their products and are paid for their time. Now, I'll put a rider in here. There's nothing wrong with being a key opinion leader as long as you declare your conflict of interest. So if you are promoting a type of treatment and you don't declare your conflict, that's not ethical. And you need to declare that conflict because it then makes people think a little bit. Are you being influenced by the treatment that you've helped develop? Or are you being influenced by the six-figure sum that the company pays you a year to promote their product? So declaration is the most important thing, and that's the bottom line. And there are key opinion leaders that declare, there are key opinion leaders that don't declare. To not declare as a key opinion leader is unethical because there's nothing wrong with being a key opinion leader. So they speak at industry-run events. They speak at conferences run by societies. They do have a substantial social media presence. And that social media presence can be quite subtle, and it's interesting to see it happen. They use terms like, oh, here's such and such rocking the house. They also talk in rather strange ways. They seem to have the need to walk up and down when they talk, or stand with their legs wide apart, or wear particularly scruffy clothes and things such as that. It's the walking that gets me. Oh, they also like those little mics that fit around your mouth as well, as if they're some sort of rock star. Those aspects, they're just almost laughable. But anyway, they like rocking the house. So, but the subtle thing about them in terms of social media presence is that they post a lot on social media. So this is a screen capture from a guy called Scott Frey. I think he used to be a key opinion leader for Henry Schein. I'm not sure that he is anymore. So he's promoting Henry Schein treatment here. So Scott's saying, patients ask us how treatment can be done so quickly while their friends are in braces. Cameron's ready to get her brace off in 2 weeks after only 10 months, just 7 months in braces. Henry Schein, sorry, hashtag SLX, hashtag Henry Schein, hashtag motion. Little picture like that. In a way, you can look at that and think, well, that's interesting, Scott, you have done that treatment very well. Are you a key opinion leader? Well, no, it's not particularly declared. And then what follows is people coming back, you know, all the likes and comments. Sarah Frey, impressive, good work, Scott and Cameron. I've got a feeling Sarah Frey is Scott's wife. Then we've got Ted Dreyfus, who's the marketing manager from Henry Schein. That's what people of all ages can get with a great orthodontist and incredible new projects like Motion 3D. The picture's building.
So tell me, Kevin, who gave the smiley face? Is it you? Was it you?
No, these are their likes.
I'm sure that is Mark, because Mark is, if people saw him, he's burst of laughing. Go ahead.
Is he okay? Anne-Marie Cantor, another key opinion leader. Good work, Scott Frey. Congratulations, the best team Motion and SLX. Dave Paquette, major KOL. Scott, nice work. Everyone deserves this treatment. Glad you're on the team. The salesmen are using social media to congratulate somebody who's done treatment with an appliance, making claims about treatment time. It's a very subtle aspect of social media. When you challenge them about this, and this gets quite interesting, I've put a picture of Uriah Heep up here, in that Uriah Heep was ever so humble all the time and almost insulted. I've challenged KOLs several times, and it's interesting the responses that you get. They want to give something back to the profession, and that they're doing this work because they're trying to help us all. Another one is, we're just being positive. You are so negative, criticizing and stating research evidence. Why can't you be as positive as we are about the products that we are promoting? Well, one reason I'm not so positive is I'm not getting paid 6 figures. It takes thousands of hours for us to put together a presentation. No, it doesn't. It doesn't take thousands of hours to put together a presentation. They are hard work, but it's not thousands of hours. And some of the presentations I've seen from KOLs, they've not taken thousands of hours to do it. And the last one is, payment doesn't compensate time away from our office and family. Well, actually, if you're getting paid 6 figures, it certainly does compensate. And if you declare it, people will see that that actually is a bit of a facetious statement. So again, we go back to that concept of key opinion leaders. Declare your affiliation. That's very important, because many of these phrases actually don't hold water when you look at that. If you want to have a look at how much key opinion leaders get paid, the United States runs this system, which is called open payments, in which you can type the name of the physician that you're interested in, the database comes up and it lets you know how much they have earned from being a key opinion leader in the last year. It goes back about 5 years.
Yeah, I'm going to send it to everyone. So guys, if you want to know how much Mark or me or Kevin is gaining, which I hope that
well, interestingly, it doesn't include us because it's not relevant to Europe. It's only the United States that do this. And I think that's that's very open actually. No one has succeeded in doing this within Europe or any other part of the world. But the data's only there, but it's only for Americans, which is a little bit unfair in truth.
And by the way, this is only the bank transfer. This is excluding the cash gifts.
Yes, but the companies are made to declare it, so okay. It's pretty accurate.
Okay.
So speeding up teeth. This was one of the issues pushed heavily by key opinion leaders, as we know. In terms of speeding up teeth, we have brackets. We have methods of super whiz brackets and wires, potions and pills, localized trauma, vibration, and light. These all were promoted very heavily by key opinion leaders and still are promoted very heavily by key opinion leaders. And also the next one that's come up, which has been promoted very heavily now, is carrier treatment. The so-called concept of sagittal first being faster and better than other ways of class 2 correction or even class 3 correction. And also it's now been picked up to say carrier treatment actually helps airways. Again, limited evidence, but being promoted by relevant key opinion leaders. Absence of evidence. So there's a complete absence of evidence when we look at speeding up tooth movement for self-ligation, micro-osteoperforation, vibration, light, and the carrier system. Heavily promoted. There's an absence of evidence about their effectiveness, and yet it continues to be promoted. If you want to get more information, just look back into my blog post. There's one I did on Let's Talk About Micro-Osteoperforation. I've done several on Excelodent. Excelodent is pretty much done and dusted now in terms of evidence, that there is no real evidence that supports its use. And they're still claiming that it's up to 50% faster, which is a very clever phrase when you're saying it makes treatment up to 50% faster, because actually it's not wrong to say, oh, it makes treatment up to 2% faster, because they're saying it's up to 50%. And it's a classic advertising trick. I get Virgin broadband where I live. It says up to 200 megabytes. Well, I get 2 megabytes at night. It's still up to 200 megabytes. So it's up to 50% faster, same phrase. I'm just going to take a side swipe here. An American orthodontist who's quite heavily on social media called Cliff Capers came up with a great saying. And he said Excelodent was the air guitar of orthodontics, in that it doesn't really do anything. And a lot of those interventions don't do anything. And I think that's very important. Yet they have been very heavily promoted by key opinion leaders, and they still are. So they've been picked up. The UK Advertising Standards Authority actually said that the evidence or the advertising that they are producing is not substantiated, it's misleading, and has to be removed from UK-based websites. And this shows what happens when the claims are questioned by government bodies, but this varies from country to country. So we have to think then, as I'm sort of coming to the end here, is are we as a profession the snake oil sellers if we're not very careful? Because where does snake oil start? Where does clinical evidence come in? And where does, clinical experience come in? And where does research evidence come in? It's a sort of a continuum going from snake oil to research evidence. And we need to bear that in mind, because it's not always the orthodontic fringe that we can be quite disparaging about that are the snake oil sellers. It can actually be some of our key opinion leaders from the claims that are made. But we don't know where that line is, and we don't know where to draw the line. So why does that approach work of making those claims and people buy it? People bought into self-ligation, they bought into Accellident, microostia perforation. They're buying into Carrier. Why does it work? Well, I read 2 books when I wasn't well a few years ago. One of these was The Cunning of Uncertainty, and one of these was Thinking Fast and Slow. A lot of us have tried to read Thinking Fast and Slow and got about into the first 2 or 3 chapters because it's quite difficult to read. Both of these books are tricky, but I sort of looked quite closely at them in terms of orthodontics. So Daniel Kahneman, in Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, says that humans struggle to think statistically. We don't like probability, we like permanence. Understanding tends to be based on a small set of observations. So you like hearing the snappy, straightforward, professional presentation. You like the anecdote. You cling to the anecdote. And we don't like chance. We don't accept probability. We want certainty. And we also assume that a past event will predict a future event. So if we get a good treatment with a twin block, we think we're going to get it again the next time round. Helga Novotny, a little more subtle, she says we actually have an aversion to loss and risk. We don't like it when things don't work. We don't tolerate uncertainty very well. We like to hear good things. And the problem with science is that uncertainties are couched in very precise terms, and that's quite important. So let's think about science being couched in precise terms. What we have here is something that I said. I was talking about incisal trauma. The important thing is I said, how certain am I of this data? You need to remember that the confidence intervals are wide. I've couched my findings in a degree of caution. Lyle Johnston, talking about functional appliances, says that if you use a functional appliance, you'll pick up 1/10 of a millimetre of extramandibular growth a month. On some patients more, on some patients less. However, you won't be able to predict width, which couching our terms quite cautiously. We're seeing this all the time, interestingly, in the COVID outbreak, where the scientists are standing up and saying, we hope this is going to happen, or we think, for example, that the R level is below 1, but they're not saying it's definitely below 1. It's a great example of scientists being cautious, whereas politicians want to be much more definite. So the converse of this approach is what tends to happen with those who are promoting treatments. So this is full face orthodontics, saying we can treat as early as 6 and 7. The most important factor that separates the new approach to orthodontics to the traditional approach is that we're making space before the eruption of the teeth. Definite statement. Dave Paquette, KOL for Henry Schein, talking about the carrier motion appliance. He says it reduces treatment complexity. It increases the speed of treatment, and treatments are completed in 12 months. It's not borne out by any research anywhere. There's no evidence that these treatments are correct. Even retrospective studies, which are somewhat biased towards the positive, don't agree with that. But yet that's the statement that's being made in a very definite way. Orthotropics, John Mew talking about orthotropics. Intervention at an early age prevents the development of problems associated with malocclusion. Orthotropics treats the causes, not the symptoms, makes the face fit the teeth, not the teeth fit the face. Again, absence of evidence. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm saying there's an absence of evidence that it works. And that's contrary to the more cautious way that other people put the evidence over. Because in effect, we don't tell people what they like to hear. They want to hear good things. They want to hear definite things. So we're working with uncertainty. Uncertainty pervades all that we do, but research reduces the uncertainty. But some key opinion leaders, leading through to snake oil and the fringe, increase that uncertainty. So what are our solutions here? Well, our solution one is education. in terms of general dentists, we need to remember that any dentist that can provide orthodontics, but dental schools don't teach students to be competent in orthodontic treatment. And in fact, by withdrawing from the undergraduate curriculum, in many ways, the orthodontic teachers haven't done ourselves any favors, because we've created an orthodontic black hole, and that black hole is exploited by some people trying to sell certain types of treatment. What about specialists? Are they all trained as well as they should be in critical appraisal? There's a dearth of academics throughout the world. Who's teaching critical appraisal to people on the residency programs? Why do they believe the salesman, or do they believe the salesman? You know, you hear this at the conference. I overhear conferences saying, oh, Dr. such and such says this, so I'm going to try it. That's not critical appraisal. That's falling for misinformation. And you wonder if one of the reasons is that the specialists aren't being taught critical appraisal. We need research, and the specialists need to understand research and to be able to appraise research, because not all research is good, we know that. So our solutions, easily said, dental schools should revisit the curriculum. If I had my time again, I'd probably be reintroducing more orthodontics into the undergraduate curriculum. Specialist societies should be more proactive. They should use social media much more than they are, because this is where the power is in terms of education, using websites, blogs, Twitter and Facebook. I am quite horrified at the power of my blog in many ways now, from something that I set up and thought, well, I'll just get 100 people reading a post if I'm lucky. Social media and blogs have a tremendous influence, and the specialist society should be doing much, much more than they are at the moment. They should probably stop publishing in journals. They should probably get into the real world of social media and start publishing their science there. And we need to promote evidence, counteract the salesman, the KOLs who don't declare an interest, and the orthodontic fringe. And we can only do that with education. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. I think I've gone a little bit over time because I'd added a little bit. I hope I've managed to sort of lead us through that concept of uncertainty in the way that uncertainty can be influenced by research, but also be influenced by many other outside factors and possible solutions, so that maybe we can get orthodontics a little bit more back on track. So I have got time to answer some